So first off, thanks everybody for showing up. Thank you to the organizers and particularly to Daniel for chairing this session. And thanks for the speakers before me for setting both an interesting and an efficient tone. I'll try to follow in your footsteps. My name is Scott Rodilitz. I'm a rising fifth-year PhD student at the Yale School of Management. And as Daniel said, I'm going to be presenting on some joint work with Vahideh Manshadi on online policies for efficient volunteer crowdsourcing. So for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to mainly focus on our motivating application of food recovery, but I want you to keep in mind that our work can be applied more broadly to general volunteer crowdsourcing platforms, and I'll try to touch on that very briefly at the end of this presentation. For now, let's chat about food recovery, which is particularly important because in the US, we waste over 60 million tons of food each year, and simultaneously, there's 37 million Americans, including 11 million children, who live in food insecure households. I should highlight, this is not an exclusively American problem. There's food waste and food insecurity in close proximity all around the world. And it seems like these problems should have a pretty simple solution in tandem. We just need to take the food from where it's being wasted and bring it to where it is needed. But unfortunately, this simple solution encounters a number of operational challenges, including two which I'll highlight for you today. First, making connections between potential food donors and potential food recipients can be challenging. And second, even once these connections have been made, the transportation between these two parties can be prohibitively expensive, particularly the last mile transportation. Now, luckily, we live in a day and age in which online platforms have emerged to combat all sorts of societal ills, and this is no exception. There's tons of online platforms that are operating in this space. I'm not going to go into details about many of them. I will highlight one of these such platforms for you, which is Food Rescue US. It's a group that we've been collaborating with for the past few years. And I'll emphasize that they use volunteer labor to facilitate this last mile transportation. In particular, Food Rescue US has had a pretty significant top-line impact. They've delivered over 30 million meals to food insecure Americans across the US. FRUS is active in over 30 locations, and in each of these locations, there's a site director. The site directors are in charge of making connections between potential donors and potential receiving agencies. Once they've made these connections, they design a schedule. So there's a pickup time and a drop-off time. And these donations are time sensitive because it's often prepared food. Now, once you have these scheduled donations, they get posted to the Food Rescue US app and website where volunteers can log in and sign up, which they frequently do on their own accord. But sometimes these donations do not get signed up for well in advance, and in that case, as this time approaches, volunteers use nudging mechanisms to encourage volunteers to sign up. Otherwise, this donation will get missed, and that's bad for a number of places. So our main research question is how we can efficiently nudge volunteers to minimize this number of missed donations. So when we think about volunteer notification, there's a few considerations we have to keep in mind. The first is that these notifications need to be infrequent. We can't inundate volunteers with notifications because they'll silence the notifications or even delete the app. And second, we can't require quick responses from these volunteers. We can't even require them to respond at all. They're just volunteers. And these considerations come from our conversations with site directors, and they're also consistent with the literature on volunteer management. Together, though, they paint a pretty challenging framework within which we need to operate, and I'll motivate that with a toy example. So suppose we can notify volunteers every 2 days, and suppose we have 2 volunteers, V and U. And there's a donation that's available today. If we want to maximize the probability that someone picks up that donation, we should notify both volunteers. And because we can't require a quick response, sequential notification is somewhat impractical. So we'll notify both of them simultaneously. That's great. Maybe one of them responds. This donation does get completed. But tomorrow, if a donation arrives, because we can't notify volunteers the next day, this donation does not get completed, and that's unfortunate. So what we have here is a classic OR trade-off between maximizing a reward that we could get today, which is achieved by notifying all the volunteers, or getting a potentially larger future benefit by saving a volunteer or 2 for tomorrow's potential donations. Now, I want to remark that the current practice at FRUS is to notify volunteers at most once per week. And when they choose to notify, they generally choose an ad hoc selection of volunteers that they have not yet notified this week. Normally it's a small subset between 1 and 3 volunteers. So one of the first things that we think we can help them with is using data to identify which volunteers are best to notify for particular donations, right? Rather than notifying volunteers randomly, can we make better notification decisions? And it turns out that we can, because volunteers have predictable and stable preferences over time. So on the left, each color represents a particular volunteer, and the size of each circle represents the number of donations with a set of characteristics that volunteer has completed. Many of these donations repeat on a weekly basis, so some of these circles can be quite large, representing a repeated dedication to a certain type of donations. All I want to do is highlight for you that there's a lot of clustering by color, which suggests that volunteers have particular preferences over which characteristics they like in a donation. And this enables us to make pretty accurate predictions using a k-nearest neighbors approach as to whether or not a volunteer will respond to a notification. So armed with this historical data, we want to help FRUS make better notification decisions. And that's the main work in this paper. So the first thing we do is introduce the online volunteer notification problem. And then based on this model, we develop online policies with constant factor guarantees. And we motivate that our policies perform well by comparing them against hardness results and by testing them on data from FRUS. So I'll give you a high-level overview of these contributions. If you want the details, you're going to have to read the paper with us. Okay, so the online volunteer notification problem is a generalization of online bipartite matching, where donations arrive in an online fashion and need to be immediately matched to a subset of volunteers. Volunteers are always in the system, even after being matched, but they're in one of two states, active or inactive. And if an active volunteer is notified about a donation, she'll respond to that notification with her pair-specific match probability, which we can estimate accurately from data as described earlier. And once notified, a volunteer is going to become inactive for a random period of time, tau, where tau is governed by some interactivity time distribution that may be deterministic, it may be stochastic. We leave it as general as we can. And our goal is to maximize the expected number of claimed donations over a time horizon. Now, because donations are completed as long as one volunteer responds, this objective is submodular. And so it's challenging to solve optimally, right? The underlying dynamic program is high dimensional. And so instead of finding an optimal policy, our goal is to design online notification policies that are simple and that perform well compared to a benchmark that knows the arrival order of donations in advance. And it turns out in the paper we're able to do just that. I won't get into the details. Suffice it to say that we designed two policies that meet this lower bound. It compares favorably to the upper bound that we establish. And these bounds are all increasing in what we call the minimum discrete hazard rate of the interactivity time distribution. It's a mouthful. It essentially means if volunteers are more likely to transition from inactive to active, we can do better. Now, one of our policies that achieves this lower bound is our sparse notification policy. And I want to highlight for you that it performs quite well when tested on FRUS data. Now here, we're requiring that we notify volunteers at most once per week. And we're comparing our sparse notification policy to heuristics that represent the current practice at Food Rescue US, which is to randomly notify a small subset of volunteers, either 1 or 3, again, chosen at random from the set of volunteers that have not yet been notified this week. I want to highlight that across locations, our policy outperforms these heuristics, generally by a factor of 2 to 3. We're encouraged by these results, and we're looking forward to implementing our policy in practice. Now that's all I have to say about food recovery. In the last few seconds that I have, I just want to mention that we think our work can be applied more broadly to volunteer management platforms. Volunteers provide a significant amount of financial benefit towards enterprises that promote social good, and yet volunteers are frequently mismanaged, and as a result, they suffer from a lack of retention. We think our approach can be used to help improve this retention component for volunteers. Thanks very much for your attention.